In the heart of the Middle East, a land steeped in tales as ancient as time itself, lies an intricate tapestry of history and people, forever overshadowed by a seemingly unending conflict. Like the deep roots of the olive trees, symbolic of the region, the roots of this discord delve deep into history, binding the destinies of the Israeli and Palestinian peoples together in a turbulent embrace. Yet the Israeli-Palestinian discord is not merely about ownership of territories. It's a tapestry of narratives, histories, and aspirations. Both sides have tales of anguish and dreams, of peace and... But for dialogue to mean anything, it must be built on mutual respect and acknowledgement. Since the Palestinian surprise attack on Israel on October 7th, the news cycle has churned with tragic tales of casualties, kidnappings, and an Israeli military response that has tripled the overall death toll. As is typical, the mainstream media presents an image of this conflict that skews in favor of the Israeli narrative. The United States has always, of course, supported the state of Israel, so our media toes the party line and forever fails to remind their audience that there are two sides to every story. Well, we don't have time, nor do I really have the energy to delve into the decades of war and animosity in the Middle East. Suffice it to say that Palestinians' anger is not wholly unjustified. They have their own story that deserves our recognition. The Palestinian narrative is one of endurance, of generations upon generations waiting and hoping for a simple plea: the right to a home, freedom, and the guarantee of safety for their children. Their history, a rich amalgamation of cultures and religions, is often distilled to mere snapshots, such as images of suffering, of rebellion, of unyielding spirit. Behind the veil of these snapshots is the core essence of a people's relentless pursuit of self-determination and justice. This is evident in every worn stone of their historic lands, every alley of old cities, and every tear of a mother who has lost a child. The Israeli occupation, its settlements, its blockades, they're not just physical barriers. To the Palestinians, they symbolize the very negation of their dreams, of their aspirations, and of their future. And yet, to truly grasp the essence of this conflict, we must travel back in time to the birth of Israel in 1948, a time seared into the Palestinian collective memory as the Nakba, or catastrophe. Historians, in their quest for objectivity, cite figures upwards of 700,000 Palestinians being displaced, leading to a refugee crisis that, like an open wound, refuses to heal even to this day. Fast forward to the present. The United Nations Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs paints a grim picture for the Palestinians. Homes demolished, access to basic necessities restricted, and a life constantly interrupted by barriers and checks. The West Bank barrier, a monolithic structure, is more than just concrete and wire. For many Palestinians, it's a testament to their curtailed dreams, their aspirations, and all forever confined within these walls. Still, the situation is further complicated when viewed through a global lens. Organizations like AIPAC wield significant influence, shaping the discourse around the Middle East in corridors of power. Their narratives, though often compelling, sometimes overshadow the myriad tales emerging from the region, making it crucial for us to sift through the noise and understand the core essential issues. In the face of such complexities, it's easy to resort to labels like anti-Semitism. While real and virulent anti-Semitism is in fact a blight on humanity, equating criticism of the Israeli state with its hatred is both reductive and dangerous. It blurs the lines and silences necessary dialogue. In a world where words wield power and narratives shape realities, we must tread carefully, understanding the weight of our words, the implications of our actions, and most importantly, the shared humanity that binds us all. It's not just about Israel or Palestine. It's about a world where every child, be they Israeli or Palestinian, can dream under a peaceful sky, where narratives converge not in conflict, but in harmony. In the intricate maze of Middle Eastern politics, there's a name that's repeatedly emergent whenever we're discussing the conflict in Palestine and Israel: Hamas. To truly comprehend what Hamas represents, one must embark on a journey that traverses the intricate socio-political landscapes of Palestine, a journey that leads us deep into the annals of history and the turbulent waves of modern geopolitics. Hamas, an acronym for, and I'm going to bungle this, I'm sure, Harakat al-Muqawama al-Islamiyah, translates basically to the Islamic resistance movement. It was born out of the first Intifada, or what some might call an uprising, back in 1987, a spontaneous mass movement against Israel's occupation. Rooted in the Muslim Brotherhood, a transnational Sunni Islamist organization, Hamas's birth was also a reflection of the people's disillusionment with the secular Palestinian Liberation Organization's, PLO, perceived inability to achieve tangible results. Hamas's charter, which has been a point of contention for many, clearly states their objective: the establishment of an Islamic state in historic Palestine, encompassing what is now Israel, the West Bank, and the Gaza Strip. This very charter has called for the destruction of Israel, a point that has been a cause of major concern, not only for Israel, but for many in the international community. It's crucial to note here, though, however, that in recent years there have been signals from within Hamas of a willingness to accept a Palestinian state based on the 1967 borders, while not formally recognizing Israel. Hamas, it's essential to understand, is not just a military entity. It's also a social and political movement. Over the years, especially in Gaza, they've established schools, hospitals, and charities. This duality, the militant and the social, has been pivotal in gaining significant grassroots support. The movement's popularity was evident in 2006 when they won a majority in the Palestinian legislative elections, a victory that took many by surprise. But this victory led to a dramatic turn of events: a violent conflict with Fatah, the leading party in the Palestinian Liberation Organization. This internal strife, often termed as a civil war, led to a deep and enduring schism in Palestinian politics. Fatah retained control of the West Bank, and Hamas subsequently took over the Gaza Strip. While Israel and much of the Western world classify Hamas as a terrorist organization, pointing to its use of suicide bombings and rocket attacks, others see it as a totally legitimate resistance movement against occupation. The lines, as with many issues in the Middle East and throughout our world, are deeply blurred, shaped by decades of pain, conflict, and deeply entrenched narratives. To merely label Hamas as a terrorist organization or a resistance movement is an oversimplification. They are a product of a complex history of resistance, occupation, internal Palestinian politics, regional dynamics, and global geopolitics. Like any other political entity, they're not monolithic. They are pragmatist. There are hardliners. There are differing views and evolving strategies. What is undeniable is the suffering of the Palestinian people, caught between the hammer and the anvil. The Gaza Strip, under Hamas's control, has faced blockades, leading to a dire humanitarian crisis. The periodic wars with Israel have resulted in a significant civilian casualties and devastation. And as with any conflict, it's often the youngest who bear its most profound scars. Palestinian children, poised on the precipice of hope and despair, face unimaginable challenges, from detention to education barriers and even death by outright violence. In the narrative-rich terrain of the Middle East, understanding entities like Hamas requires us to move beyond simplistic labels, delve deep into the intertwined histories, and acknowledge the multifaceted nature of movements and organizations. In the quest for peace and understanding, it's not just the rockets or the rhetoric that matter, but the aspirations, fears, and dreams of the people who live these realities every single day. The olive tree, with its branches reaching out to the skies and its roots firmly in the ground, stands as a metaphor for the Palestinian spirit. Reports suggest that tens of thousands of these sacred trees have been uprooted since the dawn of the 21st century. Let's hope that this assault on memory, heritage, and identity has not destroyed a Middle East prospect for reconciliation and peace. And that, my friends, is the final word up front. I am Sean Sainhart, and this is Coup Save America right here on citizens.am radio. On today's episode of Coup Save America, I am going to be talking to Peter Collins. He is a retired radio talk show host who specialized in news and politics. Peter worked in Chicago throughout the 1970s, covering stories such as Watergate, and even helping to expose the FBI's COINTELPRO domestic program. And Peter is going to join us in just a few moments, right after the break, and we're going to dive into something that is going to be rather controversial but very important, and that is a conservative project known as Project 2025 that aims to fundamentally change the entirety of the United States government. To understand this project and its possible implications, we need to first go back in history just a little bit, and Peter is here to help us bring some perspectives and some context to this project and sort of distangle the very confusing and, quite frankly, scary agendas that conservatives have in place. So we're going to be right back after the break. I'll catch you after this. And welcome back. Project 2025, Presidential Transition Program. I've got some of it printed out here. It's I think 290 page, something like that. A agenda for the next presidential transition should Republicans gain power. And let's bring in our guest, Peter Collins.
Sean,
hello, sir.
It's great to be with you.
It's great to have you. Thank you so much for agreeing to come on. I'm very excited.
Let me just thank you for your open comments. They were very measured, but well pointed.
Well, thank you. Let me, I have to admit, reading through I read the foreword by Kevin Roberts for this Project 2025, but I think that before we can really understand this, and I'm just going to let people know that this is going to be very triggering for some because this is very disturbing, but it also follows a historical trajectory, and I think that we need to get some context. And Peter, you delivered an excellent podcast on a show hosted by our friend Tom Weber, and I just was wondering if you could kind of dive into that and just give us a little bit of background into what's actually happening.
Sure, Sean. I'll begin by just saying that the oligarchs in the United States have very long-term plans to dismantle the regulatory state, the elements that remain from LBJ's Great Society, the effort to desegregate the United States, to open up opportunity, to end discrimination and Jim Crow. And all of these are at risk under a new Republican administration, which would take office in 2025. And I do like to try to set the context of the history of right-wing activism in this country. It has been extremely effective.
Oh, yeah.
And it puts left, the center, even the corporate left, the technocrats of Silicon Valley, which should just beyond me here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where I've lived since the 1970s. And the average person who doesn't identify with the right, with the rich, with Trump and the elements of fascism that his coalition includes. Many of us are really just oblivious to the ongoing operations that are extremely well funded, deeply thought out. And if Trump does manage to regain the White House in the 2024 election, these forces are aligned to take advantage of Trump as their useful idiot and to accomplish a great deal more in terms of policy, in terms of dismantling not only regulatory agencies, but the hard-fought rights of marriage equality, of access to contraception, much less abortion. And those are just, a couple of the aspects of this. The plan is extremely detailed, and I encourage people to go to project2025.org and browse through there yourselves, either while we're talking today or, at your convenience. But because I'm so old, I go back to, as you pointed out in the intro, I covered the Watergate scandal that brought down President Richard Nixon. And while he was threatened with impeachment, he wasn't ultimately impeached. He was sufficiently shamed to vacate the office. We don't have that kind of shame present in our politics today. And people are
You
proud.
don't think Trump can be shamed at this point, really?
I think it's great that the judge who put the gag order on him said, "Oh yeah, you can still claim that this is a political witch hunt."
Thank God.
But
Victory.
you can't call the prosecutor a thug. So let me just sketch briefly. If you go back to the 1980s, Ronald Reagan won the presidency based on the October surprise. That was the arrangement that was made to release the Iranian hostages, not before the election when Jimmy Carter could have politically benefited from that,
Right.
and not just after the election, but anybody who was alive and watched the inauguration of Ronald Reagan in 1981 saw him taking the oath of office with the split screen of the hostages being released from Tehran. It was not accidental. And it became the basis of the Iran-Contra scandal that did not bring down his presidency, but was an annoyance for Reagan in his final years as he was battling dementia. But just as Trump is a useful idiot for the powerful forces in our country today, Reagan was. He was this cowboy actor who was very glib and, could make people laugh as they were facing economic ruin or, illegal foreign policies. And he was in some ways like Trump, that he didn't read the briefing papers. He couldn't sit still for an hour-long intelligence briefing every day. Reagan operated off little 3x5 cards. This is before computers, of course. And so he was fed by his handlers lines that he was happy to deliver. Behind the scenes was the early initiation of the Washington-based think tank projects. And if you go back, there was a Heritage Foundation, but it wasn't as important as it is today. And it's the host or the home for Project 2025. There was the American Enterprise Institute, which was just a pro-business group. But they really were lobby groups more than policy, driven by a policy agenda. And the self-interest of their groups or their their constituents was very clear. They wanted lower taxes. They wanted to be able to pollute. They didn't want workplace safety regulations, and they wanted to keep Black and brown people down.
Right.
So after Reagan, the first Bush administration, George H.W. Bush, saw a growth in these projects. But the real organizational heft that came to all of this right-wing organizing was when Newt Gingrich decided to try to take over Congress and become the speaker, and he did. And so, again, this is old tech, but Newt Gingrich, working with the Republican pollster and a very dark Machiavellian figure named Frank Luntz, they developed language and talking points, and they distributed this on cassette tapes that were sent to Republican members of Congress and candidates, challengers who were surfacing in the primaries. And so it was a very successful effort to get everybody to sing from the same hymnal, to use the same language. The most notable one was the tagging of the estate tax as the death tax. And when you think about it, that's a very clever, if sinister, way of trying to defend people who are able to pass their massive wealth from one generation to the next. And of course, this came at a time when Bill Clinton was on the rise. So Clinton was elected in '92. He had 2 years with the Democratic Congress, and then Gingrich took over. And, up until the sex scandal with Monica Lewinsky, Bill Clinton was very cleverly repositioning the Democratic Party away from labor, away from social justice constituencies, and away from working families. His definition of the middle class had a pretty high ceiling. And Clinton deserves some credit. He worked hard to balance the budget. He tried to pass healthcare reform that was called Hillary Care. People don't remember that one very much. And so, I didn't vote for Clinton in his second election. And it was at that point that I left the Democratic Party, because he was embracing capital punishment, demonization of African American youth, the whole crack cocaine crackdown that was led by Joe Biden in the United States Senate. And so Bill Clinton, felt that Democrats appeared to be too soft on crime, so he tried to fix that. And he did bring some message discipline to the Democratic Party, but it was really for the purpose of moving it to the center right in order to challenge the Republicans, for some of the same voters. So the next stage in the development of these think tanks and external NGOs or policy think tanks was the Project for a New American Century. And this was what created the blueprint for the so-called war on terror, the response to 9/11, the invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq with occupations that lasted almost 20 years.
Yeah.
The plan to impose regime change on other governments in the Middle East, in particular Syria and Libya, and to a lesser extent Yemen, which is part of the Saudi sphere of influence. So the Project for a New American Century resonates today in the conflict that has newly erupted as Hamas, as you pointed out in your opening comments, staged this surprise attack on Israel on October 7th. And I want to point out that there are significant parallels. Number one, Israel is using the rhetorical playbook of the Bush administration developed after 9/11. That anyone who opposes us or who confronts our military power or that of our allies is a terrorist.
Yeah.
And by being labeled a terrorist, they can be called animals, they can be treated as subhuman, they can be subject to torture, collective punishment, and incredible levels of military revenge. And so we opened this can of worms, and those worms are still crawling all over the damn place. And we claim to, observe the laws of war, even as we tortured the language of the law of war by holding almost 800 people at Guantanamo at its peak who were not charged. Virtually all of them were never charged or tried. We're now down to about 15 prisoners there at Guantanamo, and that's progress, but it's come at an incredible price. And so we redefined. These were not prisoners of war, they were enemy combatants. And we claimed that they were outside the reach of the liberty and justice for all promised through the American system of justice. And so these are elements that are being reworked and implemented by Israel in this newest conflict. But they're not new tactics. Israel is incredibly skilled at propaganda. And the US media is such a willing lapdog to take the dictation from the most extreme government that Israel has ever known, and to use the techniques of our media, the parade of victims and the survivors of victims and the loved ones of people who are believed to have been taken hostage. These are legitimate stories for the media to cover, but they are presented in a way which is to manufacture consent.
Yes.
For the most extreme military action that Israel may choose to take. Now, Blinken and Biden are furiously trying to backpedal, and they're spinning themselves into knots, because on the one hand, they pledge unlimited support for Israel, and then they're saying, well, but Biden is saying it wouldn't be a good idea to conduct a ground invasion of Gaza, but it seems to be okay to bomb civilian neighborhoods,
hospitals.
And today, as we're speaking, yes, a hospital was hit by a missile, and Israel is saying, where'd that come from? Whose missile could that be? And they're saying, we don't target hospitals. Well, that is factually not true. And there's plenty of history to show that.
Yeah.
The US used white phosphorus in Iraq. We used it to shake and bake. That was the term that the soldiers used. The town of Fallujah, not once, but twice. Israel has already used white phosphorus in at least 2 episodes in the first 10 days of this conflict. So I have digressed, but I felt it is worthwhile to show the continuity.
Oh, absolutely.
Project for a New American Century, the tools and tactics that are still being employed and very effectively by dangerous right-wing leaders who have the support of the United States and of predominantly both political parties.
Yeah.
Uh, Trump has kind of once again tried to create his own box. And it's just because he's pissed at Netanyahu because Netanyahu accepted that Trump lost the 2020 election.
I know.
That aside, the unity and unanimity to the point of squelching any commentary that runs counter to the official narrative. And this was also an element that was developed after 9/11, where if you questioned the actual events of September 11th and the clear cover-up that has ensued, if you point a finger at the Saudis and say, gosh, we don't know the full story. We know that, all but a couple of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia. The two guys in San Diego were propped up by a functionary of the Saudi consulate who was receiving payments from the wife of Prince Bandar, who was Bush's buddy, the foreign minister or whatever title they confer on that person from Saudi Arabia. And so we have a great deal of an arc of continuity here. And so, resuming my thread about the organizing skills of the Republican right, one of the central people that you should take a look at if you decide to dive into Project 2025 and look at the Heritage Foundation is a former senator from South Carolina named Jim DeMint. DeMint had a safe Senate seat, and he bailed early to become the leader of the Heritage Foundation. It was roughly 2007, 2008. This ended up coinciding with the election of Barack Obama and the effort that was articulated by Mitch McConnell on day one to block everything that Obama would attempt to do, even when he did what PNAC called for, which was to surge American forces in Afghanistan, not once, but twice in his first term in office. And of course, they wanted to stop the development of Obamacare. And Obama, from the get-go, refused to embrace single payer even as an option.
Yes. And thank you for pointing that out.
He sold out.
Yes.
Before he even took the oath of office and launched his effort at healthcare reform. And he made sure that the insurance companies that swallow about 30 cents of every healthcare dollar in this country, when Medicare does it for a nickel, he made sure that the prohibition against negotiating pharmaceutical prices remained in place. And so what he did was, it was derided as socialism, and it was a transfer of wealth. He used subsidies to allow low and middle income people to buy health insurance that they previously couldn't afford. But he propped up the whole capitalist enterprise. And this was even after the debacle that he inherited from Bush, the economic meltdown of 2008, 2009. And Obama responded to that by, calling a bank robber from Wall Street, Tim Geithner, to become his guru to get us out of that mess. And so when you look at the skills and organization of the right compared to the reactive nature of what passes for the left, the Democratic side of the aisle in this country, and they're not very far left. They're only to the left of the far right. And the way I describe it is we used to have a 4-lane highway, and then they moved the double yellow line to the center of the right lane. And the left is everything to the left of that, but it's not very far left.
Yeah.
And so the Democrats, proceeded to stumble along. Obama did learn some lessons. He ended the torture program. He tried ineffectually to close Guantanamo. He didn't, other than the surges into Afghanistan, commit U.S. troops to new military encounters, but instead he ramped up the drone war.
Yeah.
And the targeted killing of individuals, which was largely curtained off from the American public. I like to remind people that the covert operations of our CIA, the other intelligence agencies of 16 or 18 different alphabet agencies that are part of this whole caustic and deep state enterprise. And yes, there is a deep state. They pretend that all of their secret operations are secret from the people who are targeted by them. And any family that had a wedding party in Afghanistan that was hit by a drone strike knows that that wasn't secret. Anybody who's had a family member, a loved one, or was actually a person who was tortured at Abu Ghraib or tortured in the black sites or held at Guantanamo without charge or trial, they know that these things are not secret. But by and large, the bread and circuses of American television and movies that celebrate war and conflict and promote lies, like the movie Zero Dark 30, that, the producers collaborated with the CIA. They cast James Gandolfini, Tony Soprano, to play Leon Panetta, the CIA director. And they sold us a load of bullshit that torture worked and that it prevented, further terrorist
attacks. Yeah.
incidents. And so the Democratic Party and its leaders have become more skilled, particularly when it comes to, as I say, manufacturing consent for really bad foreign policy. But the Republicans are so much better at it. And they have a willing frontman in Donald Trump. And when you look at Project 2025, let me just read the opening statement from their website. It is not enough for conservatives to win elections. If we're going to rescue the country from the grip of the radical left, we need both a governing agenda and the right people in place ready to carry out this agenda from day one of the next conservative administration. And this comes back to a point I made earlier, that the average non-conservative, non-MAGA American doesn't know that right-wing media every day is weaponizing the talking points that Jim Jordan, who may be the next Speaker of the House, has championed. And that is that we need to own the libs.
Mm-hmm.
We need to blame them for everything that's wrong, to distract people and gaslight them as we create the opportunity for the next train derailment to blow up a town like East Palestine, Ohio.
Yeah.
And that we criminalize a woman's right to choose and impose a Christian patriarchy through the Catholic-dominated U.S. Supreme Court. And I want to touch on a few things that are related to Project 2025, but are also part of the current status quo, the Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
It's completely in the pocket of the oligarchs and the far right. And we've had these stunning reports from ProPublica over the last 6 or 7 months about Clarence Thomas. And, a rich friend bought him this $300,000 RV. Harlan Crow took him yachting in Indonesia and got him there on his private jet. And that stuff's embarrassing. But the role of Clarence Thomas's wife, Ginny, is deeply sinister and incredibly unlawful. She has been on the payroll of the Heritage Foundation. She's been on the payroll of other groups in right-wing Washington, including the Federalist Society. They're the ones who picked all of Trump's judges.
Yeah.
That the Democrats then rolled over for in confirmation hearings.
Yep.
And Leo is the leader, Leonard Leo, thank you. He's got a double name. Leonard Leo is the head of the Federalist Society. He received a $1 billion donation about 2 to 3 years ago from an unnamed oligarch to pay for the projects that they continue to operate. And at one point, Leonard Leo told Kellyanne Conway, the woman who argues about alternative facts, he instructed her to pay Ginny Thomas another, that was the phrase used, another $30,000, and to bill it to the Federalist Society as part of a polling project that Conway was managing. Now, we only get to see certain parts of this subterranean operation when it occasionally floats into public view. But all three branches of government are now deeply compromised. You can, if you want to point to one, major cause, it is the campaign finance laws, including the Citizens United decision.
Yes, absolutely.
That have allowed unlimited money to flow into candidate campaigns.
Yep.
But we also have to acknowledge that the Congress is benefiting from all that money, and the Republicans use it to fund new campaigns, to pay for gerrymandering. And the Democrats gerrymander when they can. They really screwed up in New York State, where they overreached and ended up creating the margin of the loss of the House in 2022. But we see, for example, that the Democratic leaders in the House, and this is part of Nancy Pelosi's final years as Speaker, they allowed AIPAC to intervene in the primary campaigns that were where there was an actual contest between a progressive and an establishment corporate Democrat. And in 2020, AIPAC doesn't have, they don't spend the money directly from the organization. They have a parallel group that does that. And they've spent over $35 million, and they defeated every progressive who they targeted. And now Israel is talking about as much as an additional $10 billion in emergency funding that's going to come from a Congress that has only a dozen or so people who are not under its thumb. And I don't think I need to tell you how compromised the White House has been under Trump and to a lesser extent under Biden. Biden is not as devious or as sinister as Trump, but he has many of the same forces.
Yeah.
Ask yourself, as Americans have seen their wallets robbed by inflation, when was the first or last time you heard Joe Biden stand up and say, "We must stop the profiteering as companies raise prices and shrink the size of their products to enhance their profits at a time when, the average family is struggling to keep up with inflation, and we have the added price increases that are not a result of inflation. They are
Agreed.
flowing right to the bottom line of corporate profits today."
Yep.
So we have this incredible, group of back scratchers in Washington, and they're fighting about the border, and they're demonizing migrants, and they distract us with the culture wars about bathrooms and transgender rights. And ooh, I don't know what kind of sex they're having, but it makes my skin crawl. They're doing that on purpose
Absolutely.
so that a Congress that is currently doing absolutely nothing. I mean, the Senate got real serious before the before the speaker battle in the House, and they imposed a new dress code to keep
Oh,
John
I know.
Fetterman from showing up in hoodies and shorts.
And that changed everything.
And they're ignoring climate change. They
Yep.
will not take on gun violence. And they allow the mythology of the Republican deficit hawks to stand. And, we heard all of this hemming and hawing and posturing about how, we've got a 35 trillion or whatever the number is today debt. And, we've got to do something about it. But the do something about it never includes even modifying, much less rolling back the Trump tax cuts of 2017. They'll never talk about any modification to the Bush tax cuts of 2002.
Mm-hmm.
And they will never talk about cutting defense spending,
Oh,
a
yeah.
way to reduce the annual budget deficit or the ongoing federal debt. And I'll just throw one more item in and then stop my monologue, Sean. And that is, we have seen the efforts that began in the Bernie Sanders campaign to address the impact of student loan debt on so many American families. And I really think that Biden was just going through the motions. He saw the polling that this was popular, and he inherited the pause from the COVID pandemic in, paying back student loans. This could be fixed in a minute if Congress just, statutorily lowered the interest rate on student debt. But, both parties get money from the banks that have the contracts to fund those loans. And so we live in a house of mirrors where it's so hard to find the original image. We're seeing all of the reflections, deflections, the prismatic effect, but we never really get clear of that, of those fuzzy images to see reality behind it. And that's where we are today. And Project 2025 is already populated by some of the worst players from the Bush administration. I'm sorry, the Trump administration. There are a few
And
holdovers
Bush
from
too,
Bush
yeah.
too. Uh, and if you wish, I'm happy to go a little deeper into the agenda that they have. But that's my overview and context for this project that is a very serious effort to change our country in short order.
And Democrats don't have this coalition of think tanks like the Republican Party has. There's nothing that really equates to it. I mean, it seems that the Democrats are just completely asleep at the wheel and not doing any kind of long-term planning.
Well, the only real exception, there are some regional think tanks, there are single subject think tanks about economics, about social justice, criminal justice. But the only generalized think tank is um, John Podesta's group. I just had Center for American Progress. So they surfaced during the Bush administration, and it was an effort to counter the organized efforts of the right, but it quickly became captive to the Democratic Party and to Hillary Clinton in particular. And it's not an accident that John Podesta was her campaign manager in 2016. He had been the president of the Center for American Progress, and it was fueled by lobbyist money originally. Tom Daschle, who'd been the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, was a key player. And so it was useful, and I used their radio studios and interviewed some of their experts during the Bush administration. And they had some good people. But it was not, it was a very partisan effort on their part. And so they weren't trying to come up with the best policies. They were looking for policies that could get Democrats elected. And so beyond that, the Democrats don't have much. And the Bernie Sanders campaign really presented an opportunity for a real grassroots driven, maybe it was a mistake for him to use the term revolution because that scares people. But he really did want to rewrite the status quo, refocus the Democratic Party on working people and lower middle class families, and abandon the whole trickle down mindset that has become so central to the Democratic Party, particularly since Obama.
Oh, yeah, the neoliberalism.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. What I think is so frustrating, I'll get back to 2025, Project 2025 in a moment. It's clear to you, it's clear to me. I think it's clear to the American people what's happening. This shift to the right in both parties. And yet Joe Biden barely promised anything that was remotely progressive in the last campaign. He's not really proposing anything that's truly progressive this time around either. It's all about the fear of Trump. And it seems as though the Democratic Party has gotten by holding its voters hostage and saying, hey, we know that there's really bad things coming from the Republican Party if they get power. So you may not like us, you may not like our policies, but you have to support us and vote for us, or else your worst nightmare is about to come true. And it seems as though they're leveraging that for political gain, and they're not fighting back. They're not delivering for the American people. Would that be a fair assessment?
Yes, and I want to touch on what you said just a moment ago, and then I'll go into that. John, I will slightly disagree with you that in the first year of the Biden presidency, the administration allowed Bernie Sanders, as chair of the Budget Committee, to propose some pretty remarkable legislation to extend the child tax credit, to negotiate pharmaceutical prices, to end student debt, and to invest in infrastructure. They backed away from the Green New Deal language, but infrastructure, including to address climate change. And I was pleasantly surprised that Biden, who did campaign as a centrist and tried to separate himself from, what he saw as the extremes of Bernieism, he adopted quite a bit of Bernie's agenda, and it was Joe Manchin who stopped him, with a little help from Kirsten Sinema of Arizona. But because the Senate is so narrowly controlled by the Democrats, Biden was basically forced to eat a lot of turds by, well, maybe they were coal nuggets, by Joe Manchin. To your larger point, the Democrats have been running on fear and try to create a counter stream of fear, really since 2004. You could argue at 2000, but because that election was stolen in Florida, it's a little harder to parse it.
Right.
But starting in 2004, remember that marriage equality started in San Francisco when Gavin Newsom, now California's governor, just unilaterally allowed it. And Barney Frank called him up and said, "Gavin, don't do it. This is too far, too fast." And the late Dianne Feinstein, who was championed at her death as a great supporter of gay rights, she did do a lot as mayor of San Francisco during the AIDS crisis in the 1980s. But she was opposed to same-sex marriage. And, Biden now find his way off stage at the human rights event in Washington last weekend. But, he wants to claim that progress when, in fact, he and Obama had to be, dragged along with a movement that overtook them. So, first of all, the Republicans capitalized on fear. And Donald Rumsfeld, who was Bush's Secretary of Defense, he talked about using fear as a weapon against captives in interrogation, in torture. And he used it as a verb, fear up. And the Democrats, through their pollsters, discovered that what unites their voters and their base is that they're afraid of the Republicans. And so they learned to present what can be called a parade of horribles, where you just say, well, our party sucks, but if you elect these guys,
yeah,
you're really going to regret it. And they played that to the hilt right up through Hillary's loss to Trump.
Yeah.
And then they invented the Russia scandal.
Yes.
And this is a critical thing that some party line Democrats are starting to acknowledge. But from day one, I called bullshit on Russiagate. And,
it was so absurd.
Well, it was, and it was contrived based on these mealy-mouthed assessments from the intelligence community, two of them, one in October of 2016 and the next in January of 17. Those became the basis for the so-called evidence of the Mueller report. And, the Mueller report did show that Trump had obstructed justice. But it wasn't because Russia interfered in our election. It was, in my view, he was trying to hide his ongoing efforts to build a hotel in Moscow. and this created the opportunity for Robbie Mook, who was Hillary's campaign manager, And in one of those damn emails on Hillary's server that we were supposed to totally ignore because, uh, there's a message from Robbie Mook to John Podesta talking about how blaming Russia is the best way to explain Hillary's defeat. And I do like to mention, because I don't make a lot of predictions, but in August of 2016, I did an interview with Thomas Frank, the
Oh, wow.
Washington-based commentator and brilliant guy, historian and political scientist. And he had just been to both of the presidential nominating conventions. And he said that he thought Hillary was going to win, and I bet him $5. I said, I take no pleasure in this, but I'm betting you $5 that Trump will win. And I had just spent the 4th of July in Detroit, where I have family. And I could just tell that all of these people who'd been reliable Democratic voters for decades were not going to vote for Hillary. And some of it wasn't fair to her, but a lot of it was. She was a terrible senator. She was worse as Secretary of State. But she was next in line. And, essentially Obama had said back in 2008, and they had a meeting at Dianne Feinstein's mansion in Georgetown, where Hillary and Barack agreed, that she would support him in 2008 and that he would make her Secretary of State and tee her up to follow him in 2016. And, the Democrats ran a candidate who was deeply flawed, whose negatives were greater than Trump's. And they failed to recognize that their embrace of the techno college graduates at the expense of working people had led to a huge erosion of their base. And so, they told us, and I was doing a daily podcast up until 2020, and I relied on subscribers to make a living. And I lost a lot of support in 2016 because I wouldn't fall in line for Hillary. And my friends are all saying, well, Peter, Trump. And I said, yeah, Trump. But hey, look at Hillary. And, we're all just supposed to suck it up and, ignore reality in favor of trying to control an outcome. And so, yes, Sean, you're absolutely correct that the Democrats have used the Chicken Little approach to try to scare their voters into line. And I don't think it's going to work in 2024. And once again, the Democrats, they've prevented a primary. And I have my own reasons. I've actually met Robert F. Kennedy Jr., and I don't support him. But I support his right to run, his right to be heard. He should be debated, and there should be primary elections. And the Democrats who are standing tall for defending democracy,
yes.
Because of January 6th, my own governor, Gavin Newsom, is saying, hey, get on board. The train's leaving. It's Biden, and you don't want Trump again, do you? And so they are, dismantling what was left of a participatory system, deeply flawed, highly manipulated, often, the results were outright stolen. And the Sanders campaign, Bernie, to his discredit, did not fight back.
No, he did not.
But the way the DNC was manipulated to support Hillary over Bernie, and I still believe that Bernie could have beaten Trump.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Oh, I have no question, none whatsoever. that he would have beaten Trump. What I don't believe, at least again at this point, is that Biden can beat Trump this time around.
It's really dicey. Number one, the the things that Biden and his team claim as Bidenomics and his achievements, first of all, were all watered down by Joe Manchin, including the infrastructure. And secondly, they don't resonate with people who can't afford to fill up their car, can't afford the groceries that they were able to buy even a year ago. And as the Fed is determined to fight inflation by driving up unemployment, that's the only thing that the Fed is focused on. They're not trying to, drive down profits or, CEO pay or any other levers that are available to try to restrain demand. And, in the broadest, I hit the wall in Econ 101, but even I can say this, that the effort is to reduce demand so that people will not pay spiraling prices for goods that may be in short supply. And there are many ways to achieve that. Nixon tried it with wage and price controls, where he said, look, we're going to freeze prices, we're going to freeze wages until we get inflation under control. But it wasn't his goal to throw millions of people out of work to achieve that. And that's what Jay Powell, it's the only thing he talks about. Well, this economy is overheated because everybody's working. And, that's not really good for corporate profits. So the other thing that we need to be really candid about is that Kamala Harris is a loser.
Oh, my God. Thank you. Yes.
And she is such a drag on the ticket. And of course, for all of the identity politics reasons and the whole structure of the Democratic Party, there's this guy from Minnesota. He's like a second-term Democrat in the House. And I can't remember his name, but he made his money with the Talenti ice cream brand. That's what sticks in my head because I like that ice cream. Anyway, he went public back at the beginning of August, and he said, Democrats, find somebody else. And he took great pains, not to take pot shots at Biden for his age and his cognitive decline. He didn't say anything bad about Kamala, but he made the point, and nobody seconded it, that this is lunacy to take a candidate who is polling so poorly and expect that that's going to change within 12 months. So let me spend a minute on Kamala Harris.
Please.
Because she is a total poser. And, she was the district attorney in San Francisco. She got elected Attorney General of California. Then she took Barbara Boxer's seat in the U.S. Senate. In each of those jobs, she presented herself as smart and tough on crime, but a progressive, always a progressive. Well, in my retirement, I have volunteered for a project to pass a bill here in California to create a commission on prosecutor conduct. Because when prosecutors commit misconduct, nothing happens. And one of the most egregious cases that I have investigated involves a young man named Jamal Truelove. And he was living in a housing project in San Francisco, and one of his good friends was shot and killed. He was accused, He was tried. The attorney from Kamala Harris's office who tried the case committed what the appeals court called egregious misconduct, including lying to the jury about the credibility of the only witness in the case. Jamal Truelove drew a 50 to life sentence at the age of 22.
Jeez.
Because of the appeal, he won a new trial. And Kamala Harris, and let me be clear, she did not, directly participate in either of his trials. She showed up for the verdict in the first trial and the sentencing so she could get the camera FaceTime. In the second trial, she chose the same attorney who'd committed misconduct to try the case. And because they were prevented from using the underhanded tactics, not sharing exculpatory evidence with the defense, lying to the jury, Jamal Truelove was acquitted. He won a settlement of $13 million from the city of San Francisco for his wrongful conviction. And to this day, Kamala Harris has never even acknowledged what she did to him, much less apologized.
Yeah.
So then she went on to 2 terms as Attorney General here in California. And the highlight was that after the 2008 mortgage meltdown, her staff brought her a really strong case, a case against a company called Countrywide. It changed its name, but it was a mortgage lender. And the guy who ran that company became Trump's Secretary of Treasury. And the prosecutor's staff came to Attorney General Harris and said, we've got to go after Steve Mnuchin because we have this laundry list of violations that led to foreclosures that caused tens of thousands of people in California to lose their homes. She said no. She wouldn't prosecute Mnuchin.
Yeah.
So then she went to the Senate as a result of a backroom deal with Gavin Newsom. The 2 seats that were opening up were Jerry Brown was termed out as governor, and Barbara Boxer had announced she was retiring. So Newsom and Harris share the same campaign consultant, a very smart guy named Ace Smith. Ace got them together, and they made a deal. Kamala said, okay, I'll be a senator, you be the governor. So that's the major reason why Gavin Newsom, who some people think would be an attractive replacement, it's a mixed bag. I know Gavin, and I respect him on many levels. He just vetoed a bunch of progressive legislation that it's mind-boggling why he would do that, and that's just this year. At any rate, I do understand that he is young and attractive and has a track record that could serve the Democrats well, but he will not take on Biden because he won't take on Harris. And he will not step on her Manolo Blahniks, and so she's pretty well cemented as the VP and VP candidate for next year. And all the polling shows that she does not even attract substantial numbers of women of color.
Yeah.
And I don't want to parse it too finely, but part of the problem is that Kamala Harris's parents were from India and Jamaica. So she and Black women in this country know that she is not an African American. So they don't have a natural identity bond with her. There are some who say, I support her because she's a woman and she's a woman of color, but she doesn't get that kind of default support from the African American communities in this country. So the last part of it is that Biden, who arguably was given more responsibility as vice president by Barack Obama, has just kept her under wraps. I mean, it was particularly troubling when in early 21, he sent her, a child of immigrants, to the Central American Triangle countries, El Salvador, Honduras, Guatemala, to tell people, don't come to the United States.
Oh, right. Yeah, don't come.
Yeah. And, ask yourself, what else has she done? She's rhetorically, taken on the abortion rights duties, because Biden, has always been compromised on that because of his Catholic faith. And, the Democrats are using that as shamelessly as they did Citizens United.
Mm-hmm.
They have no intention of overturning Citizens United. The Facebook ads have dropped off, at least on my feed. But now they talk about abortion rights as if they're going to do something to restore them. It's a way to separate people from their money. And let me, at the risk of running on too much here, Gavin Newsom has been a strong proponent of gun regulations. And I support everything that he has proposed. He has, over the last 6 months, rolled out a plan to amend the Constitution to try to embed registration, waiting periods, gun magazine restrictions, things that I consider to be, pretty common sense.
Right.
But he is running ads on Facebook. He's asking people to chip in $5, and he's building an email list. That's what those things are for. And Erwin Chemerinsky, who is a celebrated attorney, and he's now the dean of the Berkeley Law School, he wrote a very thoughtful op-ed a couple of months ago that pointed out that Newsom's plan is fraught with risk, and that if you call a constitutional convention, it's going to be a pro-gun, right-wing constitutional convention. It's not going to be a meeting of fair-minded people from the 50 states who come together to say, how can we reduce the carnage on America's streets? And
Yeah.
I won't go too far into the weeds, but there's already a group of pro-gun people who have begun circulating petitions to support a constitutional convention. And if Newsom's developed, it would wind up piggybacking on that. And for a whole host of reasons, again, I won't derail this conversation for. It's preposterous to think that you can fix these problems through amendments to the Constitution in today's political climate.
Is that one of the agendas? That's one of the agendas of the Republican Party. Eventually, is to amend the Constitution through a constitutional convention. I mean, they've got a whole host of different issues that they've been challenging, where they want a constitutional convention. And I've seen. Are you familiar with something called the Wolf Pack?
I think so. Tell me.
It's this idea about trying to defeat Citizens United by getting a constitutional convention to basically rule it unconstitutional.
Mm-hmm.
It's done by Cenk Uygur of the Young Turks.
Okay.
And people have made that argument with him that you're arguing for, and he's going around, he's had much success going from getting some states to sign on to this. But people have made that argument to him that you're helping the far right to achieve one of their mandates, and their mandate is to get in a constitutional convention going where they can implement most of the radical changes in this Project 2025. Although I think they would want to go even more extreme at that point. Does that not itself just show that we're in a constitutional crisis already? I mean, have we not even exceeded a constitutional crisis at this point? We're at this point where every election, our so-called democracy, is on the precipice. We've got these radical proposals like Project 2025. We've got a radical Supreme Court, which was not a coincidence either. I mean, if you want to give the far right credit, give them right for their long-term planning, because they've been planning to overturn Roe v. Wade since its inception, pretty much, and getting the Supreme Court was exactly what they've been planning for. It seems like they've been playing the long game and not concerning themselves with electoral politics, because they don't believe they can win elections fair and square to begin with without doing these manipulative measures.
Well, first of all, just on the lighter side, there's a great movie called Grifters, where a mom and her son argue over whether to work a long con or a short con. And they'd always agreed to do the long con. And the Republicans, as you point out, do work the long con, but it's also to really propel their desire for minority rule. And that's what's really occurring here. When you peel it all back, the Republican minority, after they lost the White House and the Congress in 2008, they really did go back to the grassroots and said, look, let's take over state legislatures and governorships. Let's position to gerrymander Congress and state legislatures with the 2010 census. And that occurred, and went into effect in 2012.
Oh, yeah.
So the, most extreme example is in Wisconsin, where the Republicans get about, I don't hold me to these numbers, but they're generally accurate. They get about 48% of the vote, but they control about 65% of the seats. And this is replicated in other states. And I do hasten to point out, as an independent, that the Democrats gerrymander wherever they can, but because they didn't do the groundwork to control enough legislatures and governorships, they're simply not as successful at it. And so the other thing that the Republicans have done is activated people at the very local level. All these battles at school boards to ban books, burn books, restrict the rights of LGBTQ and transgender people in particular.
Yeah.
These are a bottom-up approach that help the top-down approach of the oligarchs that I've been talking about to lower taxes, make it easier for them to exploit people and generate more profits. That's the macro level, but at the micro level, they're running these liberty projects, and they talk about parents' rights, but it's parents who want to be intolerant. It's parents who want to impose their religion or their ultra conservative values on everybody else.
Yep.
That's called liberty. And it comes back to Frank Luntz, who has done an amazing and dark job at redefining terms. And look at woke. When I see Bill Maher every week attacking people for being woke, and he's just enabling the most extreme people like Ron DeSantis to make woke about everything. And after George Floyd, woke had a very narrow definition. It was, I'm woke about how my rights are being trampled by our criminal justice system.
Yeah.
And Trump very effectively just spun it around on its ear and made it a joke. And at first, people were a little timid about rolling it out, but with the buy-in of people like Maher, who, will pick one extreme anecdote from the Democratic left and use it to smear the entire, progressive movement, such as it is, it's quite distressing, because it's not based on rational thinking or logic. It's based on, and this is a guy whose original, his original show was called Politically Incorrect.
Yeah.
And last week he alternated between giving 1,000% support to Israel for vengeful reaction to the Hamas surprise attack. And let me just stipulate that Hamas was brutal. And they did kill some babies and some innocent people, and they're holding hostages. By definition, launching rockets at civilian populations is a war crime. But number one, there is no evidence that any baby was beheaded.
Right. Yes, absolutely.
And that's Israeli propaganda at its finest. And Max Blumenthal did a good job of exposing that the single source for that claim is an Israeli soldier with a history of extreme hateful statements about wiping out entire towns of Palestinians, including babies. And so the way this has been so effectively portrayed, and you see Bill Maher, just essentially advocating that people who are politically incorrect enough to call for a ceasefire, to call for restraint, to say you can't ask 1 million people to move in 24 hours while you bomb their escape routes and keep the Rafah border shut, so that the fish are in a barrel. It's just a matter of what part of the barrel. And that on his show last week alternated with pot shots at wokeness. And this is what passes for, elevated topical humor in this country today.
Yeah. Yeah, I can't even watch him anymore. I stopped watching him right around the 2020 elections, I think it was, where he just became intolerable to me. You touched upon something. We were just a little bit ago. You had touched upon the LGBT issue, and I just want to read. This is from an article, and this is so disturbing. One of the things that this Project 2025 aims to do is fundamentally use terms, in fact, like pornography. And I want to read this quote from this report. Pornography manifested today in the omnipresent propagation of transgender ideology and sexualization of children, for instance, is not a political Gordian knot inextricably binding up the disparate claims about free speech, property rights, sexual liberation, and child welfare. It has no claim to First Amendment protection. Its purveyors, and we're talking about pornography here, are child predators and misogynistic exploiters of women. Their product is as additive as any illicit drug and as psychologically destructive as any crime. Pornography should be outlawed. The people who distribute it should be imprisoned. Educators and public librarians who purvey it should be classed as registered sex offenders. And telecommunications and technology firms that facilitate its spread should be shuttered. And again, we're talking about pornography here, and this is how pornography is being defined. Any content discussing or portraying LGBTQ figures, from children's books such as I Am Jazz, Tango Mix 3, to the Trevor Project Suicide Prevention Hotline. And we've seen implementations of this to some degree in the Don't Say Gay laws that we've seen in Florida. And it's posited that it's also arguable that LGBTQ parents would be subject to arrest, imprisonment, and being put on a sex offender registry for, quote, exposing children to pornography simply by being LGBTQ and having children. This is how extreme this Project 2025 is. And that's just one of the most frightening aspects of it. It would also seek to criminalize any therapist, doctor, or counselor who provided affirming therapy to trans youth. It makes abundantly clear that they want to have nationwide bans on abortion and access to affirming care for trans youth, while calling upon conversion therapies to be the only available treatments. And it could be argued as well that people who are visibly trans in public are pornographic or obscene because they might be seen by a minor.
That's the liberty of gender at work.
Yeah, absolutely. Do most Republicans even want this? Are they aware of how extreme this is?
Probably not. But we have seen that since the rise of Trump, Republicans have stopped thinking in objective and rational ways. It's all this tribal partisanship. You know, what will give my side an advantage? What will own the libs? What will wipe out the grip of the radical left, to quote Project 2025?
Yeah, as if there's a radical left to be found.
Well, they don't care who gets hurt, even if it's their own children. And, you know, this whole idea of parental rights, well, it includes the right of a parent to direct their child to gender affirming care. And, you know, there are some anecdotes that surface from people who embraced the hate agenda, and then, you know, their child developed as non-binary or identifying as the opposite of their biological sex. And it caused them to be cast out by the people they thought were their friends and their
friends and
religious compatriots. And so, you know, the real big question that we're wrestling with here, Sean, is will we ever see a return to rationality? Or are we just going to see weaponized, focus group tested talking points hurled past each other to see who's left standing? And, you know, we're hurting a lot of people. We're alienating ourselves from those who don't agree with us. We are, you know, allowing our system to break down and to be corrupted. And there are just too many people, and fascism is not too strong a word. I challenge your listeners and viewers to go to any dictionary or even go to Wikipedia and look up the elements that comprise fascism. And we're there. And we're seeing people who can be manipulated and propagandized and gaslighted into opposing their own self-interest.
To an alarming degree.
Yes. And it brings me back to my friend Tom Frank, Thomas Frank wrote the book that came out in 2003 or 4 called What's the Matter with Kansas? And he came from Kansas, which used to be a progressive state. And he saw it moving more and more to the right. And he saw how voters there could be promised an end to abortion rights and be given tax cuts for the rich or a new war and expansion of the military-industrial
Mac?
complex.
Sorry about that, folks.
So increasingly, we have blocks of voters, including, on the Democratic left,
Yeah.
who are willing to just go along with what they're told. And let me illustrate this with the way Rachel Maddow herded sheep. Rachel Maddow, when I first met her in 2005, was working on the Air America liberal network. And she had a daily 1-hour news show. And she focused on the war in Iraq and had an overt element of peace in her agenda. But when she started making 7 figures, and now it's $30 million a year to work one night a week over at MSNBC,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
she got herself embedded with generals and went to Iraq and Afghanistan, put on a helmet and a flak jacket. And she led people who were opposed to Bush's wars to support Obama's terrible foreign policy agenda that I touched on earlier. And then she was the leading narrator of the Russiagate narrative.
Oh,
And
yeah, still is.
Yeah, she's unapologetic and still selling that whole tub of lard. And so, she supports Israel. She talks a little bit about restraint, but, she sees retribution as a rational response. She cozies up to the intelligence community. When I see James Clapper and John Brennan populate the panels on cable news shows,
Yeah.
without a hint of their histories,
Or any pushback.
yeah, no, they're establishment experts now. Yep. And I haven't seen Petraeus, David Petraeus, the counterinsurgency expert, who screwed things up in Iraq and Afghanistan, trotted out, but just about everybody else, is invited to come on and comment and to sell the, extermination of Hamas and whoever else happens to be in the way. And so Russiagate also created the opening for the fake news attack by Trump.
Because absolutely.
It was fake news, and the New York Times has yet to apologize or unwind any of the bullshit that they fed us. And, to their credit, the Times did acknowledge its failures in the run-up to the war in Iraq. The weapons of mass destruction, the way Judith Miller was used by Dick Cheney. But that was the last time. And there are too many people who know that they were lied to by the corporate media about Russiagate, and it leads them to doubt most, if not all, of what they're skeptical of. You know, they'll believe that a 6-year-old kid was killed outside of Chicago, but they won't connect it to the fear, loathing, and murder that the US has injected onto the world stage in the last 20 plus years. We're the
Yeah.
good guys.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the Russiagate thing really went even further, and to the point where we're now a very good chance, unfortunately, of there being a World War III. And that stems from the Russiagate, and now this hatred of Russia that we see, and this justification. Um, and of course, then you got China as well on the other side of that, where we're talking about, and Project 2025, for that matter, talks about pretty much declaring China an existential threat that we need to eliminate.
Mhm.
So we are really on the verge of catastrophe here, in terms of the prospects for a third world war, which should scare the hell out of everyone. And I don't see Democrats pushing back on that either.
No. And Sean, let me just pick up on one of those threads, because I can't solve all of these problems. But
Well, come on, you have to.
you know, this is another black, I don't want to use that word, another demerit for Obama and his foreign policy team, because we actively intervened to bring down the government of Yanukovych in Ukraine in 2014.
Yes.
We
Yes.
created the conflict in the Donbass in eastern Ukraine, where there was a war from 2014 until 2021. And, you know, I'm not a Putin apologist. And I don't believe that the referendum where he claimed that the people wanted Crimea to be part of Russia was legitimate. But I'm also a realist, and I accept that Russia has Crimea and they're not going to give it back.
Oh,
Well,
no.
you could assassinate Putin tomorrow and Russia will not give up Crimea. And so we don't acknowledge that, you know, Victoria Nuland, who is a top foreign policy advisor to Biden, was a top advisor to Obama and to Bush.
Yeah. Yeah,
She's part
absolutely.
of the neocons from the Project for a New American Century. And she was there passing out cookies and $5 billion of American
Mhm.
money in Ukraine in the period around 2014. And, you know, she helped select Petro Poroshenko as the guy who replaced Yanukovych. And then we end up with Zelensky. And, you know, Zelensky's a very mixed bag. I am not rooting for Russia to win this war, but it doesn't blind me to the fact that Zelensky is a puppet of an oligarch who has, you know, been a really good actor in being the face of the proxy war. And, you know, he's been permitted to, we send Uber jets to bring him to Washington, where he unloads his propaganda. And in his last 2 visits, he moved the goalposts. And he declared that the mission would not be complete until all of the previous Ukrainian territory, including Crimea, is returned to control of Kyiv. Well, that's not going to happen. And, you know, we could bankrupt our country, empty all of the munitions that we have in storage, including cluster bombs and depleted uranium weapons that we're giving to Ukraine now. And we will have an increasing toll of dead Ukrainians. And at some point, there will be an appetite to widen the war to include NATO. And if NATO's included, we lead NATO. And so your concerns about a World War III are not misplaced. And because, we continue to, lead a comfortable lifestyle in this country, we pay more for gasoline, or maybe, our vacations are restricted because we're not going to go to a war zone. But by and large, the average American doesn't pay a price for any of these adventures and misadventures. And we are playing dangerous games, and having, my biggest criticism of the Biden administration is on foreign policy.
Oh, yeah.
I think Tony Blinken is a very dangerous Secretary of State.
I
This
agree.
is a guy who's been Biden's advisor going back to when he advised Biden to vote for the war in Iraq. And so these things are generally taboo. I want to recommend two independent media outlets to your viewers. One is Consortium News.
Oh, they're
which,
excellent.
Yes. And they publish a lot of critical reporting that you won't see in the corporate media. And also Scheer Post, spelled Scheer. That's Robert Scheer, who's a veteran lefty journalist who I've known for many years. He does a great job of consolidating reporting from various independent media outlets. And I get alerts from them, 6 or 7 stories a day, that offer such a wider range of views and facts about what's really going on. And very little of it, trickles up into the corporate outlets.
Yeah. That's the challenge, though, isn't it? Independent news, getting people away from the mainstream narratives and into to bring back objectivity and rationality, because you're not getting that from the mainstream news media.
Well, I mean, just look at the case of the destruction of 3 of the 4 tubes of the Nord Stream pipeline.
Yeah.
And, first of all, Biden threatened to do it, and then it happened.
I know.
And then he said, well, geez, I didn't do it. I was driving my Corvette with some classified documents in the back. And Seymour Hersh, who is one of the most credible investigative reporters in the defense and national security space, did a great job of laying out a narrative. And he conceded it was based on a limited number of sources, and that the central claim that the U.S. was able to do this during a military exercise with NATO countries in the Black Sea, to me is quite credible. And then they floated the idea that 4 people rented a sailboat and that they were able to plant the explosives on the Nord Stream pipelines that were almost 300 feet below the surface. Now, I'm both a sailor and a scuba diver, and I can tell you that you can't achieve that with a 50-foot sailboat. It doesn't have enough room for cargo. You need hoists. You need, compressors to fill your air tanks or submersibles. Uh, and then we're told that, well, Ukraine did it. And
Oh, right.
so there are 4 or 5 stories that have surfaced, and the only one that really has any traction is the Seymour Hersh narrative. And, everybody's moved on, right? I'm sure as I mention this, people are saying, well, gosh, was that before COVID? Uh,
Yeah.
Because we get this barrage of misleading and distracting media on a daily basis, and nobody sticks with an important story to say, well, okay, this part of this can be true and part of it needs further investigation. It's sold as a package, and the first impression is all that sticks. Likewise,
Yeah.
the first impression about Hamas fighters beheading babies, uh,
Yeah.
that will linger. Once you embrace that, you can't unsee it, you can't unthink it. And that's how effective propaganda works.
Do you foresee, what hope do you see going forward? I mean, we're up against this crunch of time where the next election is coming right up. We've got this Project 2025. We've got climate change happening. We've got these wars that are happening. Is there hope? Do you have hope?
No. I mean, I don't want to be snarky or flip, but I can't get to that. When I started in radio back in the 70s, we were deeply involved in the Vietnam War, and it was depressing, and people we knew were being drafted and sent there and dying. And I was trained to always end a report with something happy. A kicker is what we call it in news terminology. And I can't really generate some sort of upbeat narrative that gets us through this and out the other side better than we're going in. And I don't want to just be depressing or,
Right.
Peter B. Bummer. But I have to be honest that I'm 70 years old. I came through a period where, I thought that Reagan represented the greatest darkness. And Nixon and Reagan, you could put them together as both nefarious figures. I momentarily allowed myself to believe that Obama was going to be different.
That was a huge disappointment.
Yeah. I mean, I voted for him in 2008, and Sean, that was, I started my podcast in 2009. And it's interesting because when I was doing daily radio, you do it and it's gone. But with podcasts, you build an archive, and it's pretty easy to look back.
Yeah.
And even if you just read the text that accompanies an audio file, you say, well, this gives me a sense of how this developed. And I was shocked when by 2012, I looked back at my coverage of the first Obama term and how much I found to be critical of. And I didn't seek it. It's not like, oh, I'm this badass critic and I just tear down whoever comes along, and it makes me look bigger, and people think I'm smart or something like that. I don't approach it that way. I I want a better outcome. I want the average American to have a better life. But whether it's, our failure to come to grips with homelessness and the tolerance of tent cities all over America,
Yeah.
and we're willing to send Israel another $10 billion to destroy Gaza. And we have spent a fair amount of money to try to address the crisis of homeless people and communities, but we're not serious about solving it.
No.
I
Or
mean,
climate change.
San Francisco, the downtown business district is a ghost town. And we could be opening up these vacant office towers and letting the people who are camping out on the streets come in, have shelter, access to bathrooms.
Yeah.
There's some kitchens. There are ways that you can retrofit existing facilities. But the people who own those properties have no incentive to solve those problems. And we in downtown San Francisco, we've had a wave of big ticket defaults where these giant real estate corporations are walking away from properties and just leaving hundreds of millions of dollars of debt on the table because they don't see a future. And so we had this big mall on Market Street in San Francisco. Nordstrom was the anchor tenant. They've pulled out, and this place is going to be a ghost town. And our mayor, who is pretty useless, she's saying, well, why don't we demolish it and build a soccer stadium?
Yeah. Because that's what they need.
So I have to say that, and part of this could be that, I'm getting older and I'm at that get off my lawn stage, a cranky old man. But I don't see the will to solve problems that require the have-mores to sacrifice just a little. And we have become, completely comfortable just driving past or walking past the have-nots. And, I try to practice some of what I preach. I give money to homeless people because I'm on Social Security and I'm doing okay. But I can't solve the bigger problems.
Right.
And, fentanyl has really thrown a curveball in efforts to separate addiction from law enforcement and address it as more of a
Healthcare.
public
crisis.
health issue. And this comes back to media, but in San Francisco, we're seeing 3 to 4 people a day die of opioid overdoses. If you watch TV news or read the shrinking local newspaper, you're left with the impression that it's all homeless people who are out there with tinfoil and glass pipes killing themselves. But when you really read the whole article, you learn that only 25% of the opioid overdose deaths in San Francisco are related to homeless people. That means 3 out of 4 are working people, professionals,
Yeah. Mhm.
kids who, get a hold of something they thought was Percocet. And it is insidious. And it's really hard to witness this. But, you know, we know the war on drugs failed. We know that using law enforcement to change people's behavior
It's
is a
failed.
losing
Yeah.
proposition. And so just consider this. Earlier this year, San Francisco, which the local council is called the Board of Supervisors, and they passed an ordinance to prevent the police from doing pretextual traffic stops. And this is based on solid data that these stops inordinately affect people of color and black males in particular. San Francisco's black population is less than 7%. But the people who are stopped and ticketed or jailed on a pretextual basis are 3 to 4 times higher than the population. And so they instructed the police department, stop doing that. Then, because there was a wave of fentanyl deaths on the street, the governor and the mayor met and they agreed to deploy the highway patrol, which doesn't typically get involved in street level
Yeah.
crime. And they brought them into San Francisco and they gave them permission to do pretextual stops in order to find, and they're focused entirely on a Honduran gang that does seem to have a pretty big market share of the fentanyl street sales in San Francisco. But we see, this crisis, and it's a serious problem. We see the response to it is to unravel the limited progress that we've made on making law enforcement more humane and credible.
Yeah.
So I have to say that when I retired from my podcast at the end of 2020, I was tired. And it's not just because I'm getting older, but the combination of Trump and COVID and the way he mishandled COVID, really was more stressful than anything that I have covered over the 50 years before that. And it made me feel sad. And I'm a pretty happy, upbeat guy. I don't spend a lot of time feeling depressed or bummed out. I have a balance of realism, a little bit of cynicism, but I'm one of those people who has faith in my fellow humans, who thinks that we are much more good than bad. I don't believe in biblical judgment and that kind of religiosity where people tend to posture as better than others. But I can't find a likely path forward where we actually come to terms with the problems that my generation has ignored. And I want to own that and take responsibility for it. The boomers have been so narcissistic and so focused on, feeling good, getting a buzz on, however you get your buzz.
Yeah. Yeah.
And, being able to buy a Tesla and, whatever baubles or bling you think makes you feel good. And we have left the next generations with terrible and complex, seemingly intractable problems. And on top of that, we've borrowed the money to do it. And it's not, you know, I don't think the sky is falling because we have a large national debt. But the way that is used to prevent us from using our wealth in a responsible way. And I'm agnostic. I was raised a Catholic. I still think that fundamentally the teachings of Jesus were smart and based on love. And when I see the Catholic Church that I used to belong to running a criminal cover-up over sex abuse and using the bankruptcy laws to avoid accountability, on down to the preening Christian evangelicals who, you know, have sex outside of marriage at the same rate as everybody else and want to prevent everybody else from getting an abortion.
Yep.
But do they live by that same standard? Not broadly. And so it's hard, John, because I would like to have a more positive message and a sense that, oh gosh, you know, we're going to all wake up one day and Trump will be dead and Trumpism will be gone. And the Democrats will revert to caring for the common man and the disadvantaged woman. And that, you know, we'll have a catharsis where we redistribute wealth in a meaningful way and end our efforts to pick the governments for other people. And just let me expand on that for a second, because I think it is so patronizing to hear the Israelis say that they must destroy Gaza, they must kill thousands, if not tens of thousands of innocent people to wipe out Hamas.
Yeah, I know.
And they were centrally responsible for the installation of Hamas in 2006 with the enabling of the Bush administration and Condoleezza Rice, who was Secretary of State. And this was part of a division strategy to diminish Palestinian clout by having Fatah be at odds with Hamas.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
the Israelis thought that was brilliant until about October 7th.
Yeah. I'm not optimistic either. Peter, I want to thank you so much for being so gracious with your time and coming on the show. I learned a great deal. I had a great conversation. Would love to have you back at some point. I think that this is a conversation that needs to be had. We definitely need more independent media. We need more introspection. We need more respect for each other. And we need to have a better understanding of the world that we're living in than what we do now. Because without that, we are going to fail. Where can people find you? Can people still find your old podcast?
You know, there is a problem with that, and there's no deep state cause of it. Back in May, the website where all of my archives are hosted crashed.
Oh, no.
And there is some sort of a rogue code so that when you go to peterbcollins.com, you just get a blank page. And unfortunately, after I retired, my webmaster moved to England,
Hold on
and
one sec.
I've been trying to get him to dive
Okay.
into the code and try to fix it. So the simple answer is, if you go to YouTube, there are a number of podcasts that were recorded after 2018.
Okay.
So just search Peter B. Collins podcast. But my main website is still disabled, and I hope at some point we'll be able to get that fixed.
Well, I hope that you're able to get that fixed too, because it would be a pleasure to go through some of your old archives. Peter, thanks again for joining us today and having this conversation. And
Well,
love you,
Sean,
man.
it's nice to learn about you, and I've listened to a couple of your shows. I think that
Well, thank
you're
you.
a very thoughtful and logical guy, and that you present your point of view in a way that is persuasive. But I hope that people have the same reaction I do, that that you're not a flamethrower or somebody who's trying to just generate controversy, that you're trying to expand people's knowledge and understanding.
Yes.
And I'm going to tell people about your site and your show, and hope that you find more audience.
Well, thank you so much. That means a great deal. Thank you.
My
And
pleasure, Sean.
thank you so much. And ladies and gentlemen, we'll see you next Tuesday on Coup Save America. Bye now.